welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, I'm Jenn, and this is Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'd like to introduce you to this week's guest.
Yes, this is Josh Weiss, author of Beat the Devils. I've been an entertainment journalist for outlets like Sci-Fi Wire, Forbes, and The Hollywood Reporter since 2017. And this book has been a long time coming. It's been in the works since I was in college, so it's very exciting to have it coming out now. And thank you for having me, Jen, on this podcast.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure. So what you just said actually leads into my question a little bit. I was wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit about that previous writing career, what topics and themes have been important to you, and how these previous writing experiences have helped shape this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, funnily enough, I mean, this has been like, I started the book before I even got into the kind of freelance journalism gig. I was in my sophomore year of college when I started writing it. I had just watched the original Manchurian Candidate from the early 60s and wanted to tell a Cold War thriller, kind of in that same vein, you know, Cold War conspiracy, paranoia, that in that genre. And I realized, you know, growing up, I had heard my father talking about his father, Holocaust survivor, and had wanted to tell that story as well in some capacity. I didn't know my grandfather that well, but I did want to kind of explore those themes and kind of understand how someone comes out of you know, a genocide. Obviously, you know, someone is not going to be psychologically whole after an experience like that. So I realized, you know, why not blend these two, take the kind of idea of my grandfather. I didn't know, like I said, I didn't know him that well. So I kind of just turned him into the main character and used that as a way to kind of explore those stories I had heard. And then just in terms of my career, you know, like it says in my bio, I love the convergence of pop culture and Judaism. I just think it's just, you know, it's something I can't really put into words. I just think, you know, it's such an idiosyncratic culture and religion that whenever I see it depicted in books or film or television, it just makes me giddy. So it was really that confluence of all those things that really led to this book.
That's great. Like, that touches on so many things that I want to talk about in this interview. But first off, it's extraordinarily impressive that you began to write this novel in college, because it's so sophisticated in its the way that it imagines the political setting of the world it takes place in, which we'll get to. And it's very ambitious in terms of like the storytelling and the real life characters that are used and the fates that are imagined for them. How long did this take you? Like, how long did it take to come to fruition with college and all that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And thank you for your kind words on the book. But yeah, I mean, it really started in 2015. I'd say I got about halfway through while in college and then kind of hit a wall where I stopped, I guess just plot wise. And I think like I was kind of trying to work out the ending, and I haven't said this in interviews yet, so you guys have the exclusive. I had seen La La Land with my brother in theaters, and that inspired me because I know one of the scenes is set at the Griffith Observatory. So that was kind of the seed of the idea for the climax, and I started to revisit the book. And after I had graduated in 2017, I graduated early. I started working in New York, and I was working weekends, like nights on weekends, like 11:30 to like 8 or 9 in the morning, just sucking the soul out of me. So I said, okay, I need something in my spare time that I can do something that's just for me and to help keep my sanity intact. So I revisited it during that time and finished it. Just like cranked out the second half. And yeah, so I guess I like, you know, it wasn't like a, you know, start and then, you know, I finished it months later or whatever it was years in the making. So I'd say, I don't know, I can't even quantify it, honestly. It started in the fall of 2015 and I ended it in like the fall of 2017. So yeah, that's the story of how it came together.
That's really interesting. And I think it's, you know, I have written some comics myself, and it's always interesting to me how not linear the creative process is. You know, I think a lot of people think that you sit down and write the first word until you get to the last word, and it just sort of happens that way, and it's a lot messier and a lot more complex.
It's a creative process for you.
Mhm. So let's talk a little bit about alternate history. Joseph McCarthy in this book is president. And obviously, it goes without saying that this is like a huge departure from the actual history of our country. But it's like really shocking and really interesting to have to live in this world where McCarthyism is so successful that it leads to a McCarthy presidency. There are so many details and interesting points of departure from real history, including the fates of particular famous individuals. And I'm wondering, what helped you decide what paths these folks would take in this alternate history? Like, what kind of historical research did you do in order to craft a fake history? And how do you how did that help you find where these characters end up?
Right, that's a great question. It's really more. I found, obviously you have to be at least a little bit accurate to the history to a certain degree. But I found that being when I'm doing research, I get down a rabbit hole and I'm like, oh my God, am I being too? How accurate should I be? How well should I depict these events that actually happened? And I think it's a little hindering creative wise. So I think, it really just kind of stems from my imagination, but also going, for instance, John Huston, him and Walter Cronkite kicking off the story. I mean, John Huston is so inextricably linked with the noir genre. He wrote and directed The Maltese Falcon. He made Beat the Devil, which the book from which the book derives its title. He started in Chinatown. So it was a no-brainer. He is so intertwined with this genre that I just couldn't not include him. So it was less about, kind of being true to who he was as a person and more as his career. And a lot of these historical characters are more pastiches of, kind of those golden age actors and actresses. Like John Huston's wife, for example, is not really based on who she was as a person in real life, but more kind of a Lauren Bacall sort of archetype that you'd see in a classic film noir. I mean, yes. So yes, I would say a lot of historical research went into it, but the biggest part of research was just kind of the LA setting, because I am not from LA. I've never lived there, been there twice in my life. So it was a lot of Google Street View and Google Maps to kind of get a general sense of the city. But as I say, it's more of a romanticized version of Los Angeles. Growing up on the East Coast, being a kid obsessed with movies and Los Angeles, you kind of have this idea in your head. So it's a mix of real streets and places and what they look like, but also what I've imagined. And the same goes for the Los Angeles Police Department headquarters. I reached out to them early on in the process, saying I'm writing this book and I'd love to learn more about the layout of the building, and they never got back to me. So I said, okay, I'll make it up in my head. So it's not Los Angeles as some folks might know it, but it's the way my imagination has crafted it.
I am really fascinated with LA as a noir city because it appears in so many noirs, but it's not like a very typical or expected noir setting because it's so sunny and it's so bright. And so there's like this actual interesting contrast between like the city itself and the sort of like dark things that are imagined taking place there. But I'm really glad that you brought up John Huston because I'm a huge fan of him. I love The Maltese Falcon and The Treasure of the Sierra Madre and African Queen. And so you can tell I'm actually quite partial to his collaborations with Bogart, which is like an interesting part of this book too. And I had never seen Beat the Devil, so I watched it. And I thought it was a really interesting take on the noir. And it's a really interesting, atypical Bogart movie in some ways, even though he's playing like a stock character. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with this film and the ways in which it informed or shaped the novel.
Right. Yeah. So I forget how I came across it. I guess I just like you said, I was just looking at more of the Bogart's Huston collaborations, and I had read, I think on the Wikipedia page, that it had been described as like an anti-noir, like a parody of the noir. And it's funny, just a few weeks ago, I was reading, doing more research on that, and like Truman Capote, who helped write the script with Huston, like the book makes it like it's not really like an anti-noir. It's almost like a comedy in a way, but it just felt right because of the whole uranium mine subplot, and Peter Lorre's character is kind of implied to be a Nazi, so it just felt like it hit all those checked all the boxes for what I wanted to do with this story, particularly because it's about a Holocaust survivor. So it just, it obviously is one of the lesser known kind of entries in the pantheon of what Humphrey Bogart and John Huston had made together during their careers. But it felt right because and obviously there are some references to the African Queen and Maltese Falcon and all that. But so like I said, like the whole uranium nuclear thing, it was just kind of a perfect marriage, I think.
Yeah, I think it works great. And it's a really interesting use of film history and this alternate history of the US, and then all of the different fates that you imagine for this character. Let's talk a little bit about that. There are a lot of really interesting, famous figures of the sort of like the golden age of Hollywood that are depicted in this novel. And, I am still a little bit wary of revealing all the people who appear, because I think some are just like really fun reveals. But one I want to talk about, because I thought it was super interesting, was Elizabeth Short. And I was wondering if you could talk about why you include her in all this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you said about kind of contrasting the sunny city with kind of the darker sides of humanity and corruption. I mean, what better historical event or historical figure than the Black Dahlia? So it was so much fun to keep her alive and be like, okay, what would she be like as a person? And even better, why not have her date the main character? So again, it's not a one-for-one recreation of who Elizabeth Short was, but it just felt so right. Taking these kind of, again, almost like a checklist of like, okay, what are the big events in Los Angeles, and what are the big, who are the big players in its history? And it just, and obviously the Black Dahlia has spawned, countless debate and noir and, the Brian De Palma film, obviously. So it just, yeah, it was just fun to play around with the Black Dahlia herself, such an infamous figure, and have her alive and be like, okay, she's a 2-bit actress in this world. Like, what would happen if she survived? She's a nobody. And that's just fascinating to me how, and that goes back to my love of alternate history, because like how fickle and mercurial things can be. She is famous because she was horrifically murdered. What if she survived? She's a nobody. And there is a great story by Harry Turtledove, who is like a master of the alternate history genre. And it's a story about like an Anne Frank who had survived the Holocaust and is in like an old age retirement home, and he makes reference to her like, trying her hand at writing, and she was a failure. So like, it's just, that is so fascinating to me, and such a, cool idea in a way, like these attributes that we attribute to these people, not really meaning anything if things went a better way for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Like early death kind of like consecrates people and renders them like sort of not of this world, and they become idealized and romanticized. And it's,
Right.
It's an interesting thing that happens with the Elizabeth Short figure in your book, because she's sort of like de-romanticized, but she's also made human, like she becomes more than like the death, which like overlooms everything that we know or think about her.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, thank you for saying so.
Yeah, no problem. So let's talk about our main character, Baker. As you said, he is a survivor of the Holocaust, which is loomed very recent in history in 1958, I believe, which is when the book takes place, right? And so he has obviously he has PTSD, and he is struggling with a lot of like intrusive memories of what happened to him in the camps. On top of that, he is navigating being Jewish in an America that is intensely anti-Semitic at the time. And I'm wondering, like, if you could talk a little bit about this point of view character and how you imagined him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so like I said, he was really based first on my grandfather. That was kind of the starting point. But then obviously, of course, the big hard-boiled noir heroes like Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe. And And like the old saying goes, write what you know. I'm Jewish, and unfortunately, anti-Semitism is still a thing in the world, not just this country, but the world. And especially now with not to get too heavy, but what's going on in Ukraine, they're being accused of having Nazis when their president is Jewish. So it's just it just felt like the right thing to do with this kind of story, because that was kind of a conscious effort to not only have the mystery of John Huston and Walter Cronkite, but also have a mystery of kind of Baker's past, and let the reader kind of learn about it in chunks and kind of work it out for themselves, not just kind of front load it with a bunch of exposition. So that's where kind of the flashbacks came from. And my grandfather, Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe. There's a great book by Robert Harris called Fatherland that was a big influence on this. And the main character in that book, Xavier March, was another basis for Baker, and Meyer Landsman and the Yiddish Policemen's Union. So kind of just taking my love of this, the classic noir genre, but also the neo-noir and the kind of the reinterpretations of it, taking that golden age sensibility and kind of darkening it almost a little bit, and getting a little more mature and violent and swear happy in a way. So yeah, just it was kind of like a mix of old and new, and taking it, hopefully reinterpreting it in a way that folks haven't seen before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's is a very striking depiction of trauma and PTSD too, because Baker is a very well-intentioned person, and he is ultimately, I think, a very good person and principled, but like his trauma makes him kind of messy, like he doesn't have all of his stuff together. He like has a drinking problem. And I just thought it was like a really good depiction of how carrying something that heavy would affect a person.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you were saying about, again, LA, like just contrast. I mean, obviously he's human, he's nuanced. None of us are perfect, and he wants to do good in this world, but the world is topsy-turvy. Like, he wants to do good, but he also believes that the world is irredeemable. So like he's a person at odds with himself, and that's kind of where the drinking comes from, just so he can kind of quiet his demons, not only of the past but of the present. He's seeing history repeat itself, and it's just he wants to do good, but it's like Sisyphus rolling a boulder up a hill. If he makes any progress, it just rolls back down. So it's all about contrast and nuance, and making just feel like the world is not black and white. It's gray, and that's really what this is all about.
Yeah. And I think that's something that the book does really well too, like all good dystopias do, is that it, yours is very specifically about the past, but it also does present like a distorted image of issues in our own time. And I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about how our present might inform your vision of the past. You already gotten a little bit into that, but.
Yeah, I mean, it was never, like I said, it started in 2015, and a certain someone was running for president, or trying to, and it was a bit of a joke at the time. But as I started writing, things in my book started to become reality in our world, and it got to the point where it's like, do I have like some sort of magical ability to influence the fabric of reality? Like, not that I'm a prophet or anything, but like it was just weird and uncanny, because this was not started as a reflection. It was just meant to be kind of a fun what if exercise. But the great sci-fi touchstones, be it books, film, television, always hold the mirror up to society. And it's not saying that it's a good thing that this has come to fruition or anything, but it's kind of sad how history repeats itself. And that's really what that's really kind of the crux behind the book, is how we tend to forget the past so easily, and how fragile we are as human beings, and scared, and just we are the lizard hindbrain is running things really. Like, we like to think of ourselves as so civilized and advanced, but we always come back to those, the pointing fingers and the other, and we're better than that group, and it's sad. But growing up as a Jewish person and the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, the words "never again" were always omnipresent in my home and at school. So that, I mean, it's an important lesson to learn, but it's unfortunately, we as a species just have so much trouble just getting along. It's sad.
Yeah, it occurs to me, as you speak, that societies almost react to trauma the same way that individuals do, in that like it just becomes something that they don't want to think about, like collectively, as opposed to as individuals. And that keeps it coming back in a way, because it doesn't get processed and it doesn't get contextualized. Let's go back to McCarthy a little bit. McCarthy looms large in the book, but he actually isn't really much of a physical presence. You kind of get glimpses of him through documents and speeches, but McCarthyism is really represented by its foot soldiers, the HUAC. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Obviously they're modeled off the Gestapo of Nazi Germany and the SS and the secret police that they had. But as acolytes of history will know, HUAC began as congressional hearings, to weed out communists in the government and Hollywood and all that, and led to the blacklist. So I just thought it would be interesting to kind of see the evolution of that. He took what was kind of his baby and turned it into this secret police and kind of all powerful agency that kind of that doesn't care. It stamps over the Constitution, doesn't care about your rights. It's wiretapping you whether you like it or not, arresting you, making you disappear in the night. And that's terrifying. And just saying, okay, so what you take, have you ever been a communist? And people can say their piece, and all right, they'll get jailed if they, but it has evolved to this horrific mutated monster that is out of control. And even if there's a shred of communist ties to a person, they're gonna face the consequences of this organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting to me that this government entity is basically functioning like as the villain in this piece, like rather than the sort of organized crime people.
This book is sort of like me taking the noir tropes, like we've seen police corruption or shady land deals, like in Chinatown, which again is another big influence, but sort of taking those tropes and being like, okay, what if everybody around you is corrupt, everybody is a bad human being from the president on down? How do you navigate this world? And that's kind of what HUAC is meant to symbolize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it touches on how these things are perpetrated, like, yes, by systems, and that's like what HUAC is, but also by individuals who sign up and like decide to sort of like divest themselves of personal responsibility in order to act on behalf of an institution. I just think it's like it's a very detailed and nuanced exploration of like how the society would have evolved if McCarthyism had been a raging success, which like, I'm very glad it wasn't, because like this book paints such a horrifying portrait.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating, and I want to thank you so much for coming to discuss your book with me and our listeners. This has been Jen with Turn the Page podcast, in discussion with Josh Weiss, author of Beat the Devils, which you should absolutely be checking out. And it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.